take a minute. Thanks, Caroline. Just going to take a minute and wait for some more people to join. Hi again to people who are just joining. We're just going to take another minute, wait for others to join. Welcome, everyone. It's about 4:02, so I think we'll get started here. Yeah, thank you all for joining us today. If you're here for the first time, I'll share a very brief introduction to what the STAT Community of Practice does. I'm Nina Chang, a senior associate here at Hadaway Communications. My colleagues and I serve as the secretariat for the communications community of STAT, which is convened by the Rockefeller Foundation and stands for the State and Territory Alliance for Testing. STAT started in fall 2020 with 10 charter states with a focus on testing. It has now grown to over 40 states and territories to exchange best practices and hear from experts related to all aspects of our nation's COVID-19 response. These bi-weekly Wednesday calls in particular aim to bring that overall spirit of collaboration and research rigor to specifically support strategic communications about COVID. So we're very excited to be hosting today's guests to talk about the public health community's relationship to the evangelical Christian community. This demographic makes up about 1/4 of the US population across all racial groups, and in June was found to be the religious group most resistant to getting the vaccine. It also showed among the lowest numbers saying they've been vaccinated or are planning on it. So we're going to dig into some of those numbers in a bit. To help us understand the history, context, and recommendations for public health with evangelical Christians, we're joined by Chang, a former pastor, current faculty member at Duke Divinity School, and senior fellow at Fuller Theological Seminary, and Kris, a former lawyer trained at Harvard and social impact entrepreneur in Uganda. They co-founded Christians and the Vaccine, a project in collaboration with the Ad Council and the National Association of Evangelicals to equip faith leaders with media and messaging to reach vaccine-resistant Christians. They've also testified to the US Senate and spoken widely on this topic to mainstream media in print and broadcast to convey the urgency and global importance of addressing this community. And last month, positively, Columbia and Stanford University researchers recently completed studies finding their messaging to be effective in its persuasion. We're also joined by David French, a senior editor at the Dispatch, columnist for Time Magazine, and author of the recently published Divided We Fall, America's Secession Threat and How to Restore Our Nation. This book delved into many of the topics David has spent a lot of time leading the national conversation on around politics, religion, and reestablishing national unity in the midst of so much ideological division. So as a last housekeeping note, we encourage you to leave your thoughts, responses, ideas, and questions in the chat and Q&A box, either one, as the presentation goes on. We'll be monitoring those and have time to respond to them in the second half of this session. And in the spirit of openness and learning, please make sure your chat is set to panelists and attendees. So with that, I'll hand the mic off to Curtis.
Thanks so much. It's great to be here. And in that spirit of full disclosure, I should just tell you that the three presenters here, David French and Kris Carter and myself, we've actually been friends for 25 years. Kris and David went to Harvard Law School together. The three of us have been in the same fantasy baseball league for over 20 years, a fantasy league that, again, in the spirit of full disclosure here, I've consistently dominated. So we wanted at least just to let you know that we've been doing this cause about persuading Christians to get the vaccine, not just as committed Christians, which we all of us are, and as people who care deeply about the church and how the church is related to society, but also as friends. We started this project really because it was clear that obviously the pandemic is the defining social reality of our time, and the vaccine is our best hope at ending the pandemic. And that this was an issue in which faith was going to play an important outcome because of the high levels of resistance among our own community, among evangelical Christians. And so we wanted to share with you today some insights from our work in this to see how that might actually influence how you go about your work as public health officials, and perhaps even how we might partner together going forward. We've broken up the presentation into 3 segments, one for each one of us. So David is going to open by giving you the landscape of sort of where Christians are in relationship to broader society, and especially on the vaccine issue. And David's so well equipped to do this. I believe he is clearly the most important commentator on faith in public life today. He writes for the Dispatch, has his own column there. He's also a columnist at Time magazine. So he's going to lead us off there, and then he's going to be followed by Kris Carter, who co-founded Christians the Vaccine with me. And Kris will explain a little bit more specifically our work, our project, Christians the Vaccine. And then I will close the presentation part by explaining about where we think the effort is headed next and how that might intersect with public health. We'll take about 20-25 minutes to do all 3 of those, and then leave plenty of time for question and answers. So with that, let me turn it over to David.
Thanks so much, Curtis. And I'm going to dispute the fantasy baseball domination point, but we don't have time to go into all that. I'll just start. Let's just start quickly by defining our terms. When we talk about the white evangelical community, which is the community that surveys indicated was going to be most vaccine hesitant. And if you look at the actual data on the ground, it's the heavily white evangelical areas of our country that have proven to be most vaccine resistant. I live in suburban Nashville, just south of Nashville. One county, you just go one county south of me where my parents live, and it's an extraordinarily vaccine resistant community by the numbers. So let's begin, and we'll define our terms, because there's a lot of different ways people can define evangelical. Is it a theological definition? Is it a church membership definition? And let's go with the most basic way in which people think of the white evangelical community, and that's just the exit poll definition. In other words, if you're asked to categorize yourself in a list of various communities, and white evangelical is in the list, and you check that box. Now, that's a really diverse group of people theologically, it turns out. It's a really diverse group of people by church attendance, it turns out. Self-described white evangelicals, only about half of them go to church more than once a month. But I'll tell you where it's not diverse. It is not politically diverse at all. It is overwhelmingly Republican and it's overwhelmingly GOP, overwhelmingly Trumpist, and that's very important to what comes next, to the chain of events that have occurred, that's unfolded with regards to the vaccine. Because I think if you begin to trace vaccine hesitancy is not something that has a legacy or a strong history in the white evangelical community, not at all. It's the kind of thing that before the pandemic, you would hear a lot of people in this sort of the white evangelical Republican community kind of making fun of vaccine anti-vax communities as fringe left. Was sort of the view, was the stereotype. Whether or not that actually matched the stereotype, we'll leave it to the side, but that was the stereotype. So anti-vax sentiment was not a dominant or even a meaningful aspect of white evangelical culture until the pandemic. What changed? What changed? Well, essentially what changed is that the goal and the desire to minimize the pandemic and the danger from the COVID became part of the American culture war. and it became part of the American culture war in a very specific way. We've seen a lot of survey data that says that Republicans consistently underestimate the danger of COVID. Democrats tend to overestimate the danger of COVID. But going from the very beginning, when Donald Trump indicated that COVID was no big deal, it was going to go away, there's been a consistent strain within white evangelical community because it is not politically diverse. As Ryan Burge, the statistician from Eastern Illinois University, says, white evangelicals are Republicans and Republicans are white evangelicals. That what vaccine hesitancy is, it is an extension of an existing culture war that began all the way back in February 2020 about the severity of COVID and the impact that COVID should have on our lives. With a GOP argument consistently that there should be less impact on our lives, and this goes back to lockdowns, this goes back to masks, and it goes to vaccines. And so what's ended up happening is that vaccines have become an identity marker in the culture war in this country, in much the same way that masks became an identity marker in the culture war in this country. And it's one of the reasons why we have seen the failure in many ways of things like fact checks or, bringing in a scientific argument, fact checking type of argument aimed all directly at trying to persuade people intellectually to change their mind on vaccines. Some of it has worked, some of it has not worked. But one of the reasons why it has not worked is because we're talking about core identity. We're talking about community, markers of belonging in a community. We're talking about relationships. If you get vaccinated if you get a vaccine, you can actually alienate yourself from some of your personal relationships where identity has become so important, and anti-vaccine, anti-masking, anti-lockdown has become so important as an identity marker. And so what's ended up happening is that because it has become so deeply political, what you are ending up with is a religious community that is, quite frankly, really divided, because what's happened is that white evangelicals were not traditionally anti-vaccine. And then it became a political issue, and it's created an enormous amount of tension. White evangelicals are not monolithically against the vaccine. Small majorities have indicated in surveys that they want to take it. Millions have taken it, but it's created an incredible degree of tension that is dividing families, it's dividing friendships. And I'll just say this because I don't want to keep on going too long. I'm right now in Tennessee, as I said, one county south of me, you have high degrees of vaccine hesitancy. I live in a county with moderate vaccine hesitancy. And right now, Delta is ripping through these communities, and it is creating an enormous amount of tension and shock and an increasing amount of anger. And so there is anger now and despair directed from many Christians who are vaccinated towards the unvaccinated. Especially as it's leading to more scarcity and healthcare resources. And so right now is a critical moment. There is an enormous amount of tension. There's an enormous amount of division. There is increased loss of life and despair and sadness. And this is a critical moment to speak into that culture and to speak into these communities and say, the time for hesitance has passed. The time for doubt has passed. We are seeing with our own eyes the consequences of the failure to vaccinate. We're living with those consequences today. And so I think it's a key moment. It's always been a key moment. It's getting more key as Delta is ripping through our communities. I think it's Kris next.
Yes. Thank you, David. In the context that David just described, and this wasn't a context that any of the three of us, frankly, could anticipate just how extreme it would get. But we absolutely anticipated this was going to be an issue. We'd already seen, as David mentioned, right? I mean, the culture war around COVID generally had already established several markers: masks, social distancing, and this broader sense of institutional distrust, which is something that really is critical in in the evangelical context, because quite honestly, within our own community, it is acceptable to completely distrust government institutions, or frankly, almost any kind of large institution. That's part of the sort of extreme populist sort of approach that has taken hold within the evangelical community. So in this context, and really the credit for this particular sort of visionary element of this really belongs to Curtis, who you're going to hear from in a minute. You know, Curtis and I were talking in November timeframe, and then we knew that the vaccines were coming in early December, and we were thinking about, is there something, you know, and Curtis recognized very, very early on, boy, this is going to be a big problem for our Christian community. We need to put something out there to help address these issues. So we started working. Curtis, as a theologian, started doing work around trying to address some of the things that we had already heard in terms of we started with, frankly, some of the more extreme issues. For example, you know, there's the issue that floated around the Christian community is the vaccine going to be some sort of version of the mark of the beast from Revelation? So we actually went and Curtis did a significant amount of research, theological research, and actually wrote a script and recorded an entire video specifically on that subject. So and then we just started taking other issues, again, some not quite as extreme, some more mainstream. The next and probably the biggest mainstream sort of religious issue was around the issue of abortion and pro-life, and what the connections are between the research that had gone into the vaccines and the rumors that there were aborted fetus parts in the vaccine itself. So we addressed those types of issues, and so we started developing these things. And the key to us was really, we saw some early content that was being developed by other evangelical leaders. And the first thing we noticed about it was very long. There was a video with Rick Warren and Francis Collins that ran an hour and 20 minutes on YouTube. I never even finished it personally. and you know, we were digging into this pretty heavily. So we realized that in order for our message to get out, we really needed to create short shareable videos. And so that really became sort of the centerpiece of our strategy. And then we collected those and put them into our website, which is christiansandthevaccine.com, which actually I'll share with you now, just so you can get a bit of a sense of what is here. So we've modified the header to this website recently because we're frankly just dropping some of the latest facts that we know, particularly in a time with Delta variant. There's just so much information flying around. We do feel like there are a lot of folks who just don't know what's actually true. So they might not be susceptible to conspiracy theory, but they just can't figure out which way is up. So we're trying to provide a simple set of core facts to know. But then you scroll through our website, and I'll start actually down lower. So we started here with what we call the big questions. And these are all different videos that, like I said, address everything from, is the COVID vaccine the mark of the beast, to should pro-lifers be pro-vaccine, to questions that were quite common in our Christian community about government conspiracy or how to spot fake news. And so these are all videos that range in, you know, the short end is about 6 minutes, the long end is about 15 minutes, but we tried to keep them generally under 10 minutes. And then after we got this sort of baseline content out, we started then working with a range of Christian leaders. We started with Dr. Francis Collins, who I'm sure all of you know, is the director of the NIH, and also a very outspoken evangelical Christian. So we started with this particular video and then worked our way throughout other segments of the Christian community. So just to give you a quick sense of what this content is like, I'm gonna play a little bit of the video.
Francis Collins. Dr. Collins is the head of the National Institutes of Health, the NIH, and is one of the world's leading scientists. He is directly overseeing the development of the COVID vaccines. Welcome and thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Curtis. I'm glad to be with you, and I'm glad to talk about trust. And let me say right up front, I trust in Jesus as the source of all truth, and I'm sure that we would agree that's our best foundation.
Absolutely, amen. So let's get into it. The speed that these vaccines were developed makes me nervous. Doesn't vaccines usually take many years to develop? Was this rushed and corners cut?
It is the case that vaccines traditionally have taken many years, but this was a crisis with millions of people's lives at risk. So what we did scientifically was unprecedented.
So I'll stop there just to give you, hopefully give you a bit of a sense. I would encourage each of you to, the links are in the chat. So I'd encourage you to check out the various videos. Again, the strategy around these videos is to keep them short. I told you about Dr. Collins' video where he was interviewed for an hour and 20 minutes. Our video was about 8 minutes. So we were pretty proud to be able to get someone of his stature and also his ability to actually speak very clearly. He just answered 3 quick questions and nailed them each one. And so the idea is that they're very shareable. We would absolutely encourage those of you who are trying to communicate with faith leaders in your own communities, absolutely share these videos. They're available on YouTube. They're of course available on the website. And we're also Redeeming Babel is also on Facebook, so you can find us there. One of the things I did want to point out, you saw that we started doing interviews with faith leaders. And it's just really important to understand that it actually was remarkably challenging to get faith leaders to step up. And this gets back to exactly what David was talking about. The issue became such a sort of a cultural marker, identity marker, that many evangelical faith leaders who were in fact quite pro-vaccine found themselves in the crosshairs of their own communities. Their own churches were creating real challenges for them. People like Franklin Graham, who actually stepped up pretty early on in the vaccine, when vaccines were available, and wrote an excellent piece basically saying, you know, if Jesus was here, he would get vaccinated. He got an unbelievable amount of blowback as a result of that. Other leaders like Rick Warren, J.D. Greer, who was head of the Southern Baptist Association, all of whom were pro-vaccine, found that they were under this immense amount of pressure from their own communities. So we often get asked, how come more evangelical leaders didn't step up? And the reality is it was very, very challenging for them to do so. But that being said, and this is really, I think, going to be something that Curtis is going to talk about next, the reality is that in speaking to the evangelical community in particular, and this is true of probably all faith communities, but certainly the evangelical community, faith voices are critically important. And so when public health folks want to try to reach out to people in the faith community, it is always imperative that public health partner with local faith leaders, with someone who can speak to that community. And those people do exist in your communities, even in places like rural Tennessee, where David has described. The reality is there are faith leaders who are willing to step forward. And so if local public health can connect with those faith leaders, we still believe that that's one of the most critical sort of relationships that could be established to allow you as public health folks to try to speak into this community. If you try to do it purely from a public health standpoint, because of the issues I mentioned about institutional distrust and so on, you do run into some serious challenges. So with that, I think I'll turn it over to you, Curtis.
Thanks so much. So I want to say just a few words about what we're learning from this and a macro picture and where we're headed next in our efforts and how that might connect with you as public health leaders. One of the things I really want to emphasize is that it is still critical that we try to persuade those who are vaccine hesitant and resistant. As David said, we are in a very critical point. It's critical to speak into it. And I think it's important to say that because I find even in myself, as somebody who's been working on this now for 9 months, that there is in my own self, a kind of frustration and impatience with the vaccine hesitant, especially of people in my own tribe, there's something that just wants to coerce them into getting vaccinated. Like I just want to just mandate the hell out of them. Honestly, I'm just being honest. I think that's how I feel. I think that's how a lot of the folks like me on the pro-vaccine side are feeling. And I think that's an increasing sort of sentiment in our body politic, is let's just resort to coercion and mandates and force and sort of jam these vaccines kind of down their throats, to put it most crassly. I think that's going to be dangerous if we rely on that as our primary mode. And it's dangerous for a few reasons. One is because we're now at the point, because of all that's happened, there is a fundamental cleavage of trust between this body of American citizens, American evangelicals, and the public health system. And that is a dangerous situation to be in, not just for COVID, but for the whole future. This is not going to be the last public health issue or crisis that we face. It's probably not going to be the last pandemic we face, even in our lifetime. If we burn our bridges between these two worlds, between public health and the evangelical community, it's going to make our next effort even that much harder. And it'll just, if we just resort to coercion to get through this one, it'll just reinforce that divide and reinforce the narrative that is occurring among evangelicals. This is all a plot of government control, and they're out to get us, and we have to resist and fight for our freedoms. So we can't give up on persuasion as a way to actually build those bridges between these two worlds. The other key reason why it's critical for us to keep at the effort of persuading even American Christians is American Christians are actually incredibly influential, not just in the US, for the outcome of the US, but for the whole world. We're still in the second inning of global vaccine distribution and outreach. Parts of Africa and Asia have just only beginning to get access to supplies. What's little known is that many parts of Africa and Asia culturally are incredibly shaped by the Christian church. And those Christian churches in Africa and Asia take a lot of their cultural cues from American evangelicals. And so one of our exports of America is evangelical theology. And unfortunately, one of our exports that we're already seeing is vaccine hesitance. Some of the same rumors that we've been fighting 3 months ago, have already seen pop up in places like Uganda and Indonesia and other parts of the world that are just now receiving vaccine. And it's making vaccine distribution challenging there. And so we're actually the source of a lot of vaccine attitudes. And so we have to get our voices out there, not just for the US, but for the rest of the world. And again, the pandemic's not ending until the rest of the world also gets vaccinated as well. So, and then the final reason why I think it's important to keep at this is frankly, there's actually hope. As much as the situation is dire in many parts of the country, like what David said, when you take a step back, at least if we look at the statistics, that there is actually movement happening. This PRI study, the link that I just put into the chat sign, in March, 28% of evangelicals said that they were vaccine hesitant. That went down in June to 15%. So almost half was cut in a span of just a few months, showing, and I think it's a combination of factors. Hopefully we had some small contribution to it, but I think the impact of Delta and the fact that just we have more time, more experience, more people can report about being vaccinated. There's movement. It's not as fast as we want. It's more resistant than we wish it would be. It's definitely higher in some parts of the country than others, but there is movement overall showing that this is not an entrenched situation that's hopeless. And we've also shown the same study from the PRI confirms our own research that was released by Columbia that faith-based appeals work. 40% of vaccine hesitant Americans say that faith-based approaches would make them more likely to get vaccinated. And when you interview folks who did get that, white evangelicals who did get vaccinated, about 25% of them, a quarter of them, said that faith-based approaches were important in their decision. Right. So those that did get vaccinated, like in this last several months, that were responsible for those numbers, faith-based outreaches did make a difference. And so that's why we're going to continue with our efforts. And we do need, though, the partnership of public health. Again, we view this as really our role is to serve as a bridge between our community, our religious community, and our public health leadership and institutions. And so we're reaching into one side with our efforts. We also need partnerships on the other side with public health. And this is one reason why we were so excited to do this presentation and to be in this conversation with all of you. And so we're interested in taking your questions, your thoughts about what questions either you have or thoughts you might have about what that partnership could look like. So I'll stop there and maybe we can turn it over to the Q&A portion.
Can I add one quick thing about the persuasion point, Curtis?
Go for it, David.
One of the things, when you're talking about many of the jurisdictions that are most vaccine resistant, the coercion point is moot. You're not going to have government authorities implementing policies that are going to coerce. It's not politically possible. Persuasion is your option. And so a lot of the arguments about mandates, they do apply for employers and in jurisdictions where those things are politically possible, but there's just literally no way to get past the necessity of persuasion, especially in many of the jurisdictions that are most vaccine resistant.
That's a great point, David. Thanks.
Thank you all so much. This has been highly illuminating already. Yes, I would welcome all participants to submit their questions in the chat or the Q&A. I think something I'd like to start with is recent news. So just a couple of days ago, of course, the FDA gave full approval for the Pfizer vaccine. How do you see that news affecting sentiments in white evangelical community, if at all?
Yeah, I can say I think it's going to make a difference. I mean, if you look at the amount of in our sort of hate mail, if you will, that we get, we often get how could you possibly advocate taking a vaccine that hasn't even been approved by the FDA? So I'm not sure that the approved FDA is going to convince like those very strong resistance, but I think those are the hesitant. I think it will make a difference, and it takes away one of the sort of easy, kind of lazy rhetorical moves of the vaccine resistance, anti-vaccine crowd. So I think it will help. I have no idea what meter, how much it'll move the meter, but it certainly will help.
If I could just add a layer to that. One of the things we've alluded to is, because vaccine resistance is an identity marker, group identity is a huge issue when you're, if everyone in my family is against the vaccine, everyone in my church is against the vaccine, but I'm looking around and I'm seeing the Delta variant and I'm frankly scared. And I'm now looking for some sort of face-saving way to maybe go get vaccinated. I actually believe that's one of the more profound things that this FDA approval can do, is it can just, for somebody who frankly was leaning in the direction of getting vaccinated, but is sort of being held back by peer pressure, group pressure, family pressure. And there are an amazing number of these people. I mean, literally millions and millions of them who are in that situation. Giving them a bit of a face-saving, something changed, something significant is now different. So that was enough for me to do it. And now I maybe can not get in as heavy an argument with my brother-in-law when he finds out I got vaccinated. So.
Can I field the question that's in the chat, Nina?
Of course, go ahead.
So this is a question of, do we know if leaders of important communities in, I believe, other countries, middle and low income countries, are going to carry out communication campaign? I don't know the answer for that for sure, but if it's following what happened in the US, and based on a little bit of our interaction with global public health, is there's a risk of them being very slow to realizing how important communication and persuasion is. I mean, in the US, we achieved an amazing achievement at a scientific level in terms of developing the vaccines in record time, We developed amazing logistical achievements in producing enough and getting it out into availability, into distribution channels. There was a fraction of that level of energy and resources put into thinking about messaging and persuasion, a fraction. We just blew it on that as a public health system. We were just incredibly negligent. And so, you have this example of this amazingly produced vaccine that's sitting on shelves because people are hesitant. And so I hope the global public health systems and leaders across the world will learn their lesson from the US and realize, as important as the logistics are, the messaging is just as important. And that to get early on that, and for them to develop partnerships with faith leaders in their own communities so that messaging can happen early and not play catch up the way we are in the US.
That's a really thorough call to action. I'm curious about, so you alluded to this, but some of the more specific faith-related concerns about the vaccine. You mentioned mark of the beast, definitely abortion-related concerns, but are there any others that the public health community should be wary of, sensitive to, and how would you recommend addressing them? Is it head-on, or is it kind of skirting the issue? What have you seen works?
Yeah, I think there's other issues. I would say a lot of that is bundled under distrust of government and distrust of government institutions. And so I do think a lot of ones of our videos talk about that, of the need for trust, for the need for all of us to trust institutions to know anything in the world, not to be blind in that trust, not to be sort of suspend all critical faculty, but that a fundamental posture of distrust is simply unfeasible to know anything in the world, and is not how God designed us as human beings to know things in the world. So that's in our videos. People want to do that. Specifically to your strategy point, I think what's actually important to underline here is public health. Speaking as secular public health, you're probably not going to be the appropriate voice to actually persuade evangelicals, because you're already distrusted by those communities. So the strategy is not for you to say something. The strategy is for you to partner with trusted leaders in the faith communities, elevate their voice, convene them. I think that's another key strategy, is actually just convening leaders in your community. This is what was not done with American evangelicals. So some of the example of the leaders that Kris mentioned, Franklin Graham, J.D. Greer, Rick Warren, who did come out, what's interesting is they all came out as individuals, and they all came out at different times. Right? There was no united front of leaders of evangelicals. And so what happened was Rick Warren came out, got blasted, we retreated. Franklin Graham came out, got blasted, retreated. J.D. Greer, right? When you're the only person out there and you get blowback, it's scary. You're gonna retreat. And part of the problem with American evangelicalism in general, is we're such a decentralized movement that we don't have a pope. There's nobody that can convene us, right? So, and there's a kind of a competitive dynamic in evangelicalism, so that it's hard for any one person to say, hey, everybody rally around me. So you actually need an outside entity to actually convene American evangelicals to have a common voice. And this is actually where public health could have made a difference. If the White House or some other government institution had taken the trouble and had the political will to actually convene faith leaders to say, hey, let's bring you guys together. You guys come up with a common message, common front of messaging on that. I think that would have made a big difference, rather than this ad hoc, everybody steps out with their toes and then gets squashed on their toes dynamics, which is what we have happen.
One thing to add on to that, I would say that if you're talking to a vaccine resistant evangelical in the South, just what you're going to see is most of them don't actually have a theological objection to the vaccine. The vaccine objection is going to sound a lot like the vaccine objection of somebody who's completely secular. It's going to be, it's untested, or the FDA rushed, or there's kind of a whack-a-mole aspect to it. If you knock down one argument, another one pops up, and you knock down one argument, another one pops up. And I do think that one thing, though, that you can do with a evangelical objector is you can answer secular objections with faith-based arguments.
That's right.
About the kinds of obligations we have to our neighbors, for example, is a faith-based response to some secular arguments. And so I do think that that's an important distinction here that can indeed, and again, nothing here is the killer app. we're talking about peeling away like layer after layer. Like as Kris was saying, the FDA approval is going to persuade some people, literally teaching them that showing folks that there was no chip in there, persuaded some people. Saying that it isn't the mark of the beast, persuaded some people, but it's just chipping away when everyone is sort of looking for the killer argument. And that's been incredibly elusive.
I could also want to go back to what Curtis was talking about in terms of this idea of convening and public health's role of convening faith leaders. I think what he was alluding to was what we hoped would happen at a national level, but it's important to know that even if it is too late to do that at a national level, it can still be done at a local level. The research is pretty clear. About 85% of evangelical pastors are pro-vaccine, way higher than the people who are sitting in their pews.
Mm-hmm.
So actually, I'm from Tulsa, Oklahoma, right? So and I know, I know several pastors in Tulsa, Oklahoma, all of whom would love to be convened by the Tulsa Public Health Authority to have a conversation about this. None of them can step forward on their own as a solo practitioner and lead the charge. But if you got 10 pastors across Methodist and Baptist and non-denominational in that community to speak together and to strategize together about the community that they understand, that maybe the public health person in Tulsa doesn't understand, but lives in, there's hope there. So I just want to encourage the idea of local cooperation with faith leaders is I think a critical opportunity.
Let me speak to the Holly's question, since I am the one person pastor here on this list, or at least former pastor. How does a faith leader in a heterogeneous church encourage vaccines without crossing the line to being political? Should it be pulpit, individual, written messaging, etc.? Great question. One of the reasons we created these videos to be short and shareable is honestly, as a former pastor, I realized that if you expected a pastor to do all the heavy lifting on this subject from the Sunday morning pulpit, that was going to be challenging, especially in certain communities like the one that David is talking about, because you're asking a pastor to get up in front of a congregation that he or she, mostly in the evangelical community, it's a he, had struggled already to keep together through the pandemic and through the political divides of the election and so forth. To ask that pastor to then speak on a very divisive topic, which they know there's already some portion that are going to feel very passionately opposed to a message like pro-vaccine, even if the pastor is pro-vaccine, that's just incredibly hard for them to do. So Kris is putting up here a video we did that advises pastors on how to approach this subject. Our basic strategy our encouragement has been, look for other ways than the pulpit. Share these videos, post it on social media. You can do in text message, like definitely communicate, tell people this, but you don't need to do it on Sunday morning where you're such a visible sort of sitting duck, frankly. And that, frankly, it's not in a contentious subject. One-way communications is frankly not necessarily the best way to go about it, which is what a pulpit is. It's a strictly one-way conversation, right? So the pastor should be looking for ways to have those two-way conversations and interactions, where there's much better chance to establish empathy, trust, to work out misunderstandings quickly, and so forth, where there's that back and forth. So that's our general recommendation.
Curtis, what would a good relationship look like between a pastor and maybe a public health leader? Like how could they make that relationship stronger so that public health can use them as a messenger most effectively? And also, what are the tactics then? Is it they're sharing videos, they're posting on social media? What are some of the other ways that they can help utilize each other?
Yeah, it's a great question. I do think what Kris said and what I've said before also is doing it in convenings is always best, because I think you do double duty here. One, you're doing them a service by bringing them together with their peers and helping them feel like they can approach this issue on a common front. And two, it's just frankly going to be a lot more efficient for you as a public house to meet together with 12 pastors than 12 individual one-on-one meetings. So I would definitely recommend convening. So if you're a public health official, you should right now be researching who are pro-vaccine pastors in your area that you could be inviting to some sort of convening on this. So that's one thing. And then the other would be to provide resources to help them elevate their voices. So make them aware of Christians and the vaccine. And then ask them, what do you need? What would help you? Maybe it is some more materials or resources that they want to distribute. Maybe it's some funding for them to actually do a social media campaign and do some social media advertising in the community. There's been very little funding by public health for social media outreach, especially in religious communities. And that's really where this battle is being fought. I mean, where this misinformation is spreading is on social media, and where the possibility of trust is going to be in social networks, right? Of your family member sharing something or friend sharing something, and that happens on social media primarily, right? So public health should be investing much more energy and resources to equipping pro-vaccine Christian voices to get heard on social media.
Kind of following that thread a little bit, where have you seen positive examples already of public health interacting with faith leaders through social media or using social media in a way that really reaches white evangelical Christians, that movable middle that you're talking about? Do any come to mind? Kind of leaning on that hope part.
Yeah. Kris, why don't you tell the story about Robert Jeffress?
Sure. So, one of the videos that you might be familiar with Robert Jeffress. He's the pastor of First Baptist Church in Dallas. It's a huge church, about 14,000 people attend there. He was also a very vocal Trump supporter. In fact, if you see the sort of famous picture of President Trump surrounded by faith leaders, Jeffress is the one standing right next to him, praying over President Trump. So he has a lot of credibility within the conservative Republican white evangelical community. And he is loudly pro-vaccine. And so we did a video with him, which I would encourage you to take a look at. Quite honestly, he took a pretty courageous position, because many in the community that he represents, including even in his own church, gave him a lot of pushback. So he was a really great example of someone, really speaking to the core of that community, and sharing not just the sort of evangelical faith element, but the political element, and being able to say, look, I, as a conservative pastor, he says in his own video, he said, I've had to bury too many people, right? I'm pastor of a large church, which means I actually have to do COVID funerals, and I don't want to do these anymore. So it was really a powerful message coming from somebody who has his perspective. So I would say finding voices like that is certainly valuable in terms of trying to punch.
Hey, David, I think you might need to mute there. I think you're playing something or somebody's sending it.
No, not me.
Oh, who's that?
Maybe we're good now.
Okay. So yes, that was the end of my point. So.
Okay, thank you, Kris. David, did you have something to say or add?
Yeah, I was just going to add to that so much of the resourcing here is actually impactful by resourcing the pro-vaccine evangelicals to interact with their vaccine hesitant family members. Because what's actually happening right now on the ground are millions of conversations between aunts and nieces, between fathers and sons, fathers and daughters. This is where it's being fought out right now. If I had to talk about my extended friend network. My extended friend network is all pro-vaccine, my peers, and every one of them has at least one anti-vaccine parent or uncle or aunt. And so they are consistently engaging in these conversations about vaccines, and they're the ones who are actually vacuuming up the information. And so yes, we should be absolutely directly reaching the people who are anti-vaccine, but it is very important to preach to the choir here on this, because you're kind of equipping the choir, so to speak, with the tools that they need to address the objections that are being raised. And that's something that, it is not at all wasted effort to further inform pro-vaccine Christians of better and better arguments, because the arguments against the vaccines are constantly evolving. And so the arguments for the vaccines have to constantly evolve as well. And one of the most recent evolutions in the argument is how, for example, is Israel proving, the experience of Israel proving that vaccines don't work? That's the new one. That's a new argument I hear. And so it's very, very important to continue to equip the pro-vaccine evangelical community, because they're the ones sort of negotiating directly with aunts and uncles and brothers and sisters and nephews and nieces. That's where the core of this is happening.
That is such a critical insight. We have about 10 minutes left, so just last couple questions here. Speaking of equipping and equipping the choir, we have an anonymous question here that the most common sentence they hear as a reason not to take the vaccine is, quote, "the body is my temple." This is a very specific one, but how would you respond to that?
Rather than going into it, I would just encourage folks to go to our site, because we have a number of videos that address that issue from a sort of different angles, because that sort of comes up on sort of on the abortion thing, on the government control thing, so I think it's good to highlight that. I think it's addressed in a number of different ways. So I encourage folks to check it out. I want to say one other thing here for public health officials, which is that one of the things that you are going to, I believe, especially in the United States, how you're going to interact with pastors in this next phase of vaccine outreach is on the issue of religious exemptions. So what we're finding is that increasingly, as mandates are coming out from schools or from educational institutions and so forth, that the vaccine resistant are seeking to get around that by getting a religious exemption. And so public health officials are going to be drawn into that fray in terms of whether or not this is a valid approach. And that's going to, and so the, vaccine hesitance, pastors and public health are going to meet, I think, in this next season in this highly contentious ground around religious exemptions. And so I just wanted to flag that. And it's going to be an important issue to address. And it's one that we're among us are talking about how are we going to equip the church and pastors to rightly understand these things like the request for exemptions, and also for public health officials to take it. I think there's going to be this mistaken notion that a religious exemption is valid so long as the person holding it, quote unquote, sincerely holds this belief. So the idea that somehow like sincerity is all that matters in terms of whether or not a religious exemption matters. I think actually that's, you'll find even public health officials and in fact lawyers who somehow subscribe to this. That is not how religious exemptions work. There has to be a religious tradition that upholds that, not just an individual's subjectively feeling it. Well, I sincerely believe this thing, and so. But we're going to need to educate our people on even on that issue, because that's going to be one of the next. In terms of when David says the whack-a-mole, I think that's the next mole that's coming up.
And just to add, to pile on there for a second, Curtis, there's no religious exemption that authoritatively allows you to put other people at risk. That's not you won't find that in any, in the Christian religion, in any religion whatsoever. There's not an exemption that says I should be able to be a nurse and go into a hospital unvaccinated and put people at risk. I think that's it's a pretty, Curtis is right. It's going to be a frontline point, and it already is becoming one. We get requests. In fact, believe it or not, the #1 search term on Google that gets people to our website is people searching for a religious exemption. And even after they see our content and see what we're about, they still email us asking us for religious exemptions, at which point we have to explain that's not what we do, and we don't even believe that that's a thing that you should be seeking. So
Yeah, how do you deal with that when you have leaders of religious organizations like the Vatican or bishops coming and saying, no, we believe the vaccine is, good and that you should get it? How do you deal with kind of like that leadership, and then those under it having different viewpoints?
Well, that goes straight to the distrust of institutions. And so what's ending up happening is I think a lot of people have a view of sort of the white evangelical community, especially the subset of the community that we are talking about here, as being sort of easily led. And so if it's just the right people that will say something, that will make giant progress. But if there's ever a symbol of the fact that there's sort of a who's leading whom kind of question, it's when Trump endorsed the vaccines at his most recent rally and was booed. Only time I've seen Trump booed at his rally. So there is a sort of a cultural dynamic that in many ways is out of there is no single leader that can bring it to heel. And it's one of the reasons why there's such a fear on the part of pastors to address this as something that could split their church wide open. And so, that's why the collective action issue that Curtis has been talking about and Kris has talked about, the convening, anything that you can do that can sort of keep one person from being singled out as a target is going to be helpful. But that's why this is so hard. There was actually a priest was testifying in, was it Ohio legislature earlier this week? And someone said to him, he was testifying against vaccine mandates. And someone said to this priest, well, the Pope is supportive of vaccines. And he said, well, the Pope isn't really Catholic. Wait, when you're dealing with that level of distrust, that appeal to authority just flat out doesn't work. But what does work is that negotiation and relationship between family members and people within the circle of trust. And that's why it's so important to equip them to be able to handle those interactions.
Caroline,
Actually-
thanks.
sorry.
Curtis, go ahead.
One other thing, the reason why we created these videos as resources, and why I think as public health officials, if you are interested in equipping Christian advocates of the vaccine, is to help them find these videos or other videos like it. Is the other thing that's when the negotiation is happening on that relational level, you want the person who's pro-vaccine to be able to be the trust bearer, to be the person that's injecting trust into the environment. It's asking a lot for any one person to be injecting both the trust and the substance and the information. So our strategy is basically, we'll provide the substance information. That frees up the family member to bring the trust. And frankly, because sometimes people are going to get angry about the substance or dispute that. We want them to be angry and disputing with me as a disembodied figure on a video, not their aunt or uncle or friend, right? So it's sort of, we want the aunt and uncle to say, hey, take a look at this video. I think it makes some good points. And boom, they've applied the trust to this content. Now the feelings of the content, I'll bear the weight of that. And if I don't know them, it doesn't really matter. So so just think about that as kind of what is a good recipe for how to approach this.
That is super insightful. Thank you. So I know we're at time almost, but I was curious, is there anything that has surprised all of you, any of you, over the last year and a half, just something you've learned about really your own tribe or your own community? I see some grimacing.
is there anything that hasn't surprised us? Honestly, that's the laundry list would take another hour. So
if you'd have come to me in March 2015 and you had said, David, 5 years from now, there's going to be a global pandemic. It's going to take the lives of more than 600,000 Americans. And the evangelical community is going to be disproportionately opposed to public health measures that mitigate the spread of the pandemic and in the pandemic and contribute to the deaths of uncounted thousands of people, I would have said to you, I think you're an anti-Christian bigot because we're not like that. That's not who we are. This is not our ethos. This is not our morality. And you know, one of the things I think that's been so humbling about this process, to be honest, is understanding the extent to which things like partisanship, and specifically negative partisanship, animosity, can completely corrupt and pollute theology and morality. And even in communities that uphold theology and morality as paramount principles. And that's been profoundly humbling. And it makes you spend a lot of time saying, what happened? Where did we go wrong? And just to be completely transparent about it.
Yeah, I would just put my own personal gloss on that here, is just that, you know, the Christian term for what David is describing, where an identity, like a partisan identity, trumps, use that term deliberately, trumps our faith, Christian identity. That's called idolatry. That's the biblical term for when that identity trumping happens. And I think what has been just sobering is, idolatry has always been a problem among followers of God. It's a big theme throughout Scripture. The depth of which this idolatry is present in our moment right now is quite sobering. So this is not actionable for public health officials, but it's mainly just to give you a window into the lament that some of us who see this idolatry are feeling. And we're trying to act on it, but there's also a great deal of grief and sadness about this. And so just something for you to know.
Well, it does sound like all communities have a lot in common then, which is, yeah, something that we share. Thank you so much for your time. This has been really special. Thank you for just pulling back the curtain a little bit on this specific community. For anyone who's still here, resources will be sent out at the end of the week. Caroline has shared some details on that. And please email us back in the invite language or the invite email if you have any other questions. And thank you so much again. Thank you. Have a good afternoon.
Well.